I can pretty much guarantee that everyone watching this video has at least heard of a tabletop role-playing game, a TRPG. Even if you haven't heard that term, you've definitely heard of Dungeons & Dragons, the most famous TRPG. TRPGs, though, despite the name, aren't just games. The TRPG is a distinct creative medium, just like books or theater, and like every medium, it has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. Today, we'll be discussing what TRPGs are, how they function as a medium, and what all of that means for authors. Before we go any further, we need to define some terms. To start, we should define what a genre and a medium are. As an example, we'll use The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, genre is a bit tricky to define. A genre is something like science fiction or fantasy. It's a set of conventions that, taken together, distinguish one set of similar works from another. Since genre distinctions can be really blurry, we'll be mostly focusing on medium going forward. The medium of a work is what we might call a format. It's a tool or a technology that we use to present a text. For example, the medium of The Hobbit is a physical book, as opposed to a magazine or a movie. At this point, you're probably asking, wait, what about the Hobbit movies? Those aren't books. And you're right. The medium of The Hobbit as a movie is a film, not a book. The genre, though, is still fantasy. More or less, the same story, in the same genre, can be presented in two different media. And this illustrates an important point. Genre and medium are, to some degree, independent. One medium can host many genres, and one genre can be expressed in many different media. With that in mind, let's take a look at how different media work in practice. With any creative work released to the public, the author or authors eventually create a final product that the audience sees. To get to that final product, authors may go through various levels of drafting. They'll produce partial, incomplete versions of the work, then revise and edit the work until it reaches what will be, to the audience, the actual text. For the sake of our discussion, we'll use the term drafting to refer to any planning and preliminary work that the audience is not intended to see, and we'll use finalising to refer to the process by which the authors codify the final work that the audiences will actually see. Now that we've established our terms, let's examine drafting and finalising in two different media that are adjacent to TRPGs, books and improv theatre. First, let's look at books. Although much of this discussion applies generally to all books, we'll be looking specifically at narrative books. The important thing for our purposes is that books are an asynchronous medium. On the one hand, drafting for books is asynchronous. Authors can plan books in any order, and the order of the drafting and planning process does not have to match the order of the final product. Authors can plot out the ending first, the beginning second, and everything else last if they want. Similarly, the process of finalizing books is also asynchronous. The final form of a book can be revised from its draft form in any order, regardless of the internal timeline of the book or the order of the drafting. The audience will ultimately experience the book in an order independent from the order of composition. Now, this is not to say that books can't be edited after their initial release. J.R.R. Tolkien released several different editions of The Hobbit with various changes, and the version of the book that you probably know is not the same as the original published work. Critically, though, even a new edition of a book, one where the author has responded to the audience, is still produced by the author and consumed by the audience asynchronously. The author can still edit the book in any order, and the audience can still read it in any order. In stark contrast to narrative books, improvisational theater is built almost entirely on fast-moving response. That is, unlike asynchronous books, improv theater is a synchronous medium. For our purposes, we'll be discussing improv theater that is performed by a group of actors in front of a live audience. There are, of course, other forms, but this one is the most relevant to our discussion. With that in mind, drafting in improv theater is largely non-existent. By its very nature, improv theater is unplanned. An actor in an improv theater troupe explained it to me like this.
You have literally no time to mull over how you should shape the narrative. A lot of the time, it just comes to shaping it however you can in that moment, and then reckoning with the effects of that after the fact.
But if drafting in improv theater is non-existent, what can we say about finalising? Well, finalising in improv theater is synchronous. The final text of a performance is defined by what the actors perform and what the audience observes. The actors create their final work live, and the actors in the audience experience this final text at the same time and in the same order. Now, before we get into how this all relates to tabletop role-playing games, I'll give a brief explanation of what TRPGs actually are. At their core, TRPGs are games, but they're very open-ended games based heavily on role-playing narrative. In a TRPG, there are two roles that participants take. The first is the game master, also called dungeon master, storyteller, or a whole variety of terms. For our purposes, we'll use the term Game Master, or GM for short. The participants who are not GMs are known as players. Most TRPG groups include one GM and several players. The GM's job is to create and maintain the game, and the game's shared fictional world. The players then are participants who control individual characters within that world. Like any other game, TRPGs have rules. The rules in TRPGs define how characters interact with the world. For example, there are rules describing what happens if a character wants to climb a steep hill or swim across a river. Put all these elements together and you get the typical gameplay loop of a TRPG. The GM describes a setting where the players' characters are located, the players say what they want their characters to do, and the GM adjudicates the results of the characters' actions, often referring to the game's rules. In many, if not most cases, the outcome of a character's actions is defined in part by rolling dice. But what does this all mean for TRPGs as a medium? In contrast to the two media we've already discussed, TRPGs are a sort of hybrid medium. They're both synchronous and asynchronous. Now, we've been defining synchronous and asynchronous based on how authors and audience experience a text, and that division of people doesn't work perfectly here. The GM and the players in any group play the role both of authors, capable of changing the shared fictional world, and of audience, observing how the other participants change the world. With that in mind, we can still apply the terms synchronous and asynchronous based on when parts of a text are defined versus when other participants see them, which is what we'll do going forward. First, the process of drafting for a TRPG is asynchronous. GMs can plan and prepare for gaming sessions in any order, whenever they want. They can draft for sessions far in the future or plan at the last moment for a session in a few hours. The GM in our previous example might have come up with that river and drawn it on a map weeks or hours before describing it to the players. Now, it's important to note that drafting for a TRPG is not the same as drafting for a book. In a book, the author defines exactly what the characters will do within the world. Tolkien didn't have to wonder if Bilbo and the dwarves would get through Mirkwood intact, because Tolkien was the one deciding how his world played out. GMs, though, run worlds in which other people's characters can do things the GMs don't expect. As a result, GMs often don't draft everything, relying instead on their skill at improvising scenarios for the players. Maybe our example GM hadn't thought about that river before the moment the players decided to try a shortcut through the woods, and the GM decided that the forest had a river in it. This is all starting to sound a lot more synchronous than asynchronous, and that's because we're getting into the unambiguously synchronous process of finalizing a TRPG. TRPGs, like Improv Theatre performances, are finalized synchronously. The codified real events of the story happen when all the participants, GM and player alike, experience them together in a gaming session. In such a session, GMs and players participate in a sort of guided improv. The GM might have prepared a river beforehand, so when the players come across it, their improvised reactions are based on some existing, asynchronously prepared information. But how the players choose to handle the river is decided in that moment. For example, maybe they want to boat across it instead of swimming. That is an improvised decision, made synchronously as the story plays out. Equally important to on-the-fly decision-making is the role of dice in a TRPG. No person, GM or player, can wholly predict how any in-game event involving dice will play out. In our example, if the players decide that their characters want to swim the river, then one of them rolls badly and their characters nearly drown, then maybe the players' characters will try to boat across. But that element of randomness, of sudden and synchronous additions to the world and to the story, is rather unique to TRPGs. Overall, TRPGs are a hybrid medium, somewhere between books and improv. Like books, they involve a degree of asynchronous drafting, but they are finalized in a manner much more similar to Improv Theatre. That is, synchronously. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Allow me to explain with a personal anecdote. Years ago, I started bouncing around ideas in my head for a fantasy world. I loved world building and having a creative outlet. I loved the process of drafting and planning and outlining. But after I tried to finalize a story in a book, I ended up losing motivation to write during the asynchronous finalizing process. I tried it a few times and I could just never get it to work. I even tried making a video game out of my project and I couldn't get through the asynchronous finalizing stage there either. What ultimately helped me express my world building was when I started running a TRPG. Finally, I could draft and plan in the asynchronous way that I loved, and I could finalize things not in a long, asynchronous process, but in a fast, audience-responsive, social, synchronous setting. I must assume that I'm not the only person who's struggled with finding the right medium to express creative world-building projects. If there are some writers out there who could really benefit from TRPGs as a medium for their work, I hope they might see this video and give the medium a try. Maybe there are some people who have started running TRPGs and are having trouble dealing with the differences between fully asynchronous books and partially asynchronous TRPGs. To all of you though, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that at least some of you have found it helpful. Remember, every person is different, and so is every medium, so find the one that's right for you.